Evan Johnson, a 27-year-old engineer from Santa Fe, was accustomed to a life full of challenges. Every day started early and ended late. Working 2 jobs to pay off his college debts, taking care of his mother whose treatment demanded exorbitant expenses, and constantly repairing the old house he had lived in since childhood, all of this had become his routine. At times, he felt like he was living on the edge of his limits. That evening didn't seem out of the ordinary. Evan was on his way home, riding his worn-out bicycle through the streets of Santa Fe. The wind carried dry leaves, and the sun had already set, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold. Just one last hill remained when his phone vibrated in the pocket of his jacket. Hardly anyone ever called him, especially at this time. "Hello," he asked, balancing the handlebars with one hand and fishing his phone out with the other. "Is this Evan Johnson?" The voice of an elderly woman was firm, slightly authoritative, like someone used to being in charge. "Yes, this is him." "Who's calling?" "My name is Helen Whitmore," came the response. The name was familiar to Evan. Helen was a renowned philanthropist and a prominent figure in Santa Fe. Her projects promoting arts and culture frequently made it to the local news. "I'm sure you've heard of me." "Yes, but," Evan hesitated. It was hard to imagine someone of her stature calling him personally. "How can I help you?" "It's I who must help you," she said, her tone calm but sharp. "Tomorrow at 7 p.m. at La Palma Club. It's important. Don't be late." Before Evan could ask anything, the line went dead. He stopped, trying to process the conversation. Thousands of questions flooded his mind. Why would this woman want to meet him? How did she even know about him? Was it a mistake? Or maybe a prank? At home, his mother was waiting for him. Her health had recently taken a turn for the worse. Frequent bouts of coughing, weakness, and endless medication. She was sitting in her room, trying to smile as Evan walked in. "You look tired, son," she said, adjusting the blanket on her lap. "It was a hard day at work," he replied, sitting down next to her. "But it's nothing. Everything will be fine, Mom." Later, during dinner, he shared the strange phone call. His mother frowned, her expression serious. "Maybe you should go," she suggested. "Helen Whitmore isn't just anyone. If she wants to talk to you, she must have a good reason." "But what could she possibly want from me? I'm just an ordinary engineer." "I have no connection to her projects," Evan said, shaking his head. "Sometimes we don't understand why fate brings certain people into our lives," his mother said softly. "But if someone offers help, perhaps it's a sign." The next day, Evan couldn't get the upcoming meeting out of his head. All day at work, he tried to focus on blueprints, but his hand would absent-mindedly draw lines in the wrong places. Finally, at 6 p.m., he set out for La Palma Club. La Palma was one of the most luxurious places in Santa Fe. Pristine gardens, marble columns, and the soft glow of lanterns, all exuded wealth and status. Evan felt out of place in his simple jacket and worn shoes. As he stepped inside, a porter greeted him. "Good evening." "Your name?" the man asked coldly, clearly sizing Evan up. "Evan Johnson. I'm here at Mrs. Whitmore's invitation." "Go ahead. She's expecting you," the porter said, nodding and gesturing toward a door at the end of the hall. Evan walked down a long corridor and entered a small but elegant office. In the center of the room sat an elderly woman with impeccably styled silver hair. She looked stern, but her eyes gleamed with intelligence. This was Helen Whitmore. "Evan Johnson," she said, looking up. "Have a seat." Evan cautiously sat down across from her. His palms were slightly sweaty from the tension. "You're probably wondering why I invited you," Helen began, studying his face intently. "Yes," he admitted honestly. Helen paused, as if gathering her thoughts. "My proposal might seem strange to you, perhaps even shocking. But I ask you to hear me out before you make any decisions." Evan frowned, not understanding where this was going. "What do you mean?" "I want you to marry me," she said clearly. Evan blinked, thinking he had misheard. "Excuse me." "You heard me correctly," she replied calmly. "This isn't a marriage in the traditional sense. It's a contract. I'll help you pay off your debts, cover your mother's medical expenses, and ensure your financial stability. In return, you'll become my husband." Evan sat motionless, staring at Helen, trying to process her words. Marry her? A contract? It sounded utterly absurd. "Is this some kind of joke?" he finally managed, raising his eyebrows. "I never joke," Helen replied calmly, her face remaining impassive. "This is a business proposition. You have nothing to lose, Evan. I know about your debts, your mother's illness, and how hard you're working to stay afloat. This offer is your chance to change everything." Evan frowned. "But why would you need this? You have everything, money, status. Why me?" Helen leaned forward slightly, her eyes glinting in the light of the desk lamp. "Because I need more than just a husband. I need a partner who will follow the rules and not ask unnecessary questions. I'm older than you and not looking for romance. This is an arrangement. You'll give me the social standing I need for my goals, and I'll give you the kind of life you can only dream of right now." "This is insane," Evan muttered, struggling to find the right words. "Perhaps," she agreed. "But think about your options. Go back home and keep working 2 jobs while your debts slowly crush you? Or take my offer and start a new life?" Evan remained silent, feeling a growing sense of hopelessness inside. He had no answer. Finally, he muttered, "I need time to think." Helen nodded, showing neither surprise nor disappointment. "You have exactly 1 night. I want your answer by tomorrow morning." She rose from her seat, signaling that the meeting was over. Evan followed suit, still in a daze. As he left the club, the air outside felt heavy, as if the city itself knew about the offer he had been given. At home, his mother was waiting for him. She noticed the tense expression on his face but didn't press him immediately. Only after dinner, when Evan had gathered his thoughts, did he tell her everything. At first, she looked stunned, but then her expression turned serious. "Evan, I know it sounds strange, but maybe you should consider it." "Mom, it's ridiculous. Marrying a woman I barely know? And for a contract? How else are we going to get out of this situation?" Her voice trembled. "We're already at the brink. Your health is suffering from this pace of life. If this is a chance, maybe you should take it." Evan looked at her, noticing how exhaustion and illness had etched deep lines into her face. She wanted a better future for him, even if it meant taking such a desperate step. He spent the entire night awake. His thoughts raced, but one fact remained clear. He had felt trapped for a long time. By morning, after taking a shower, he put on his best suit and headed back to La Palma Club. Helen was waiting for him in the same office, with the same calm demeanor, as if she had known he would return. "Have you made your decision?" she asked, holding a cup of coffee. Evan took a deep breath. "I agree." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "A wise choice." A week later, Evan stood at the gates of Helen's massive estate on the outskirts of Santa Fe. The property was surrounded by high stone walls, beyond which rose a mansion in the style of historic Spanish architecture. Impressive and intimidating, it radiated both luxury and isolation. A security guard checked Evan's identification and escorted him inside. The house was silent, so quiet that the sound of his footsteps echoed through the halls. Helen met him in the grand foyer, dressed in an elegant cream-colored gown. "Welcome to your new home, Mr. Johnson," she said with a slight smile. "I hope you're ready for the changes ahead." Evan looked around. The interior was breathtaking. Marble floors, massive paintings in gilded frames, exquisite furniture. Yet beneath all the opulence, he felt a chill. You're not required to do anything except honor the agreement, Helen continued. Your role here is simple. Follow my instructions and don't ask unnecessary questions. Evan nodded, feeling the weight of his decision beginning to settle on him. That first night in the mansion, he stayed in a guest room. The massive bed felt uncomfortable because of its sheer size, and the silence in the house was almost oppressive. When he tried to open the window to let in some fresh air, he found it was locked tight. The same was true for other windows. Evan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. But by whom? The staff in the house were so discreet that their presence was only felt when they delivered meals or cleaned the rooms. Late at night, wandering through the long corridors, he heard whispers behind one of the locked doors. He stopped, straining to make out the words, but they faded away. Evan knocked, but no one answered. The next morning, he questioned the head butler, an elderly man with a piercing gaze. "What's behind the door on the second floor? Why is it locked?" The butler frowned slightly before responding. "It's better if you don't concern yourself with such matters, Mr. Johnson. It will bring you no good." Evan felt a growing unease. What was hidden within these walls? And had he just made the biggest mistake of his life? Days blurred into weeks, and Evan's life in Helen's estate grew increasingly bizarre. He tried to adapt to his new routine: breakfast, meetings with Helen, occasional trips to town on her errands. Yet, there was something inexplicably unsettling about the mansion. On his first free day, while exploring the house, Evan discovered that most of the doors were locked. Every time he tried asking the staff about them, they avoided his questions, casting him brief, cryptic glances. The tension in the air felt like the calm before a storm. One night, unable to sleep, Evan decided to revisit the second-floor corridor where he had previously heard whispers. Passing a row of rooms, he came across an old wooden door, now slightly ajar. Behind it was a narrow corridor leading downward. His heart raced, but curiosity overpowered his fear. Descending the staircase, he found himself in a small room resembling an archive. Dust-covered shelves were stacked with folders, boxes of documents, and old photographs in frames. The dim lighting gave the room a foreboding atmosphere. Evan began sifting through the papers, hoping to find something that could explain the mansion's strange aura. His attention was drawn to a folder labeled Johnson. Inside, he discovered legal documents connected to his late father. It turned out that Evan's father, while working as an accountant, had been involved in questionable financial schemes. These dealings had led to the bankruptcy of several businesses, one of which belonged to Helen's late husband. The documents detailed how her husband had lost everything and ultimately taken his own life. At the time, Helen had been left destitute, rebuilding her wealth and influence from scratch. Even more disturbing were the photographs of other men, roughly Evan's age. They had seemingly lived in the mansion too. But what had happened to them? Why had they disappeared? Evan's heart sank. He began to suspect he was part of a dark and intricate plan. The next evening, at dinner, Helen noticed his tense demeanor. "You seem troubled, Evan," she said, studying his expression. "I trust life here is treating you well?" He tried to mask his unease with a facade of calm. "Everything's fine. It's just an adjustment." Helen smiled, but there was a cold glint in her eyes. "Good. I hope you understand that life here requires following certain rules. Any deviation could have consequences." Her words felt like a warning, and Evan once again felt like a bird trapped in a gilded cage. Later that night, he tried to call his childhood friend, Mike, who worked in IT. However, the connection was blocked. His phone displayed only, "No network." This deepened his suspicions. Now he was certain someone was monitoring his every move. The next day, weighing the risks, Evan decided to take a bolder step. He returned to the archive room to spend more time investigating. His findings confirmed his worst fears. Helen wasn't just seeking revenge. She used these marriages as tools of control. Among the documents, he found contracts similar to the one he had signed, each bearing the names of other men. Each contract outlined a strict set of rules, with severe consequences for any breaches. Additionally, he stumbled upon a laptop hidden behind one of the boxes. On it were old video recordings made by one of Helen's former husbands. In the videos, the man spoke about his life in the mansion and how Helen had gradually turned him into a pawn under her complete control. "She played us like chess pieces," the voice on the screen said. "I thought this was just a business arrangement, but it turned out to be far more complex. There's no way out, except one." The video cut off abruptly. Evan closed the laptop, feeling panic rising in his chest. He needed to act before he ended up in the same trap as the others. Later, sitting in his room, he managed to contact Mike using an old phone he had found in the archive. His friend's voice was filled with concern as Evan recounted everything. "This sounds like a nightmare," Mike said. "But if you found her old documents and that laptop, it could be your chance. I'll see if I can dig into her financial records or connections. But you need to be careful." Evan nodded, even though Mike couldn't see him. He knew his friend was right. Any misstep could cost him his freedom, or worse. The next morning, Evan entered Helen's office. His hands trembled slightly, but he tried to maintain composure. "We need to talk," he said, attempting to mask his tension. Helen set down the book she had been reading and looked at him, narrowing her eyes. "Is something wrong? I want to understand why you chose me. You say this is just a contract, but I'm starting to think there's more to it." Her face remained impassive. "You're a smart boy, Evan. But sometimes too many questions lead to unnecessary consequences." Evan felt anger bubbling inside him. "This isn't about love or even an agreement, is it? It's about my father. You're trying to avenge what he did to your husband." Helen's eyes flashed, and she rose from her chair. "You really want to know the truth? Fine. Yes, I chose you because of your father. But this is more than just revenge. You're a part of my chess game, Evan. And I move my pieces as I see fit." Evan stood there, fists clenched. He realized he had been drawn into a game far deeper and darker than he had ever imagined. "If you think you can leave this game without consequences," Helen continued, her voice sharp as a whip, "you are gravely mistaken." Evan knew that confronting Helen was a risky move, but staying silent could cost him even more. After their tense conversation, he returned to his room, locking the door behind him. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. The next morning, Evan resolved to tread carefully. Using the old phone, he contacted Mike again and discreetly passed him the laptop through a hidden passage that led outside the estate. Mike promised to crack it and uncover whatever secrets Helen was hiding. Evan knew their time was running out. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at the mansion grew increasingly tense. The staff became even more elusive, as if they sensed that something was brewing. Evan felt constant eyes on him, though he couldn't pinpoint who was watching. Security at the gates had been tightened, and his movements were noticeably restricted. One day, while wandering the halls, he encountered Mr. Harris, the head butler. The older man stood by a window, gazing out at the desert beyond the estate. Gathering his courage, Evan approached him. "Harris," he said quietly, "I know you've worked here a long time. Can you help me?" The man turned slowly, his face calm, though his eyes betrayed tension. "I thought you might eventually ask for help, Mr. Johnson," Harris said. "But you must understand, what happens in this house is beyond your control. Why are you here? Why do you keep working for her if you know what she's doing?" Evan's voice trembled with a mix of anger and fear. Harris hesitated before responding. "Everyone has their reasons. So do I. But if you want to get out of here, you'll have to be smarter than her. She's used to always winning." Those words only strengthened Evan's resolve. Late that night, he received a message from Mike. "Evan, I found something." Her bank accounts are full of transactions tied to illegal activities. Helen uses offshore companies to hide her dealings. And there's more evidence of bribes to high-ranking officials. But the most damning part? Files mentioning the disappearances of several men who were apparently her husbands. This could be serious leverage. Evan's heart raced. This was his chance to expose Helen, but he knew her power and resources made this a dangerous move. The next morning, he made a decision. He discreetly contacted local journalists and provided them with copies of the evidence. Mike took on the task of securing the data, ensuring it couldn't be erased. In the meantime, Evan continued to act as if nothing was amiss. He knew that if Helen suspected his betrayal, the consequences could be far worse. But her words during another dinner made him tense. "You seem preoccupied, Evan," she said, setting down her fork. "I hope you're not trying to play a game you can't win." Evan forced a tight smile. "I'm just tired. All of this, it's a lot to adjust to." Helen continued to study him, her gaze sharp and calculating. Her lips curved into a faint smirk, but her eyes remained cold. "You're a smart young man. I trust you understand that crossing certain lines would be unwise." The warning was clear. Evan felt a chill run down his spine but didn't let it show. A few days later, the journalists published a damning exposé on Helen, including evidence of her illegal activities. The news spread quickly across the state. Evan knew there was no turning back now. That evening, police cars with flashing lights arrived at the estate. Officers poured through the gates and began searching the house. Evan watched from a window as they moved inside. Helen remained eerily calm, though the tension on her face was unmistakable. "Is this your doing?" she asked, meeting his gaze in the living room. Evan stood his ground, despite the fear coursing through him. "I did what I had to. Your actions have destroyed countless lives, including mine." Helen smirked, her eyes blazing with anger. "You think you've won?" she whispered. "The game has only just begun." As the officers escorted her out of the house, she turned to Evan one last time. "You'll regret this, Evan. Consequences always catch up to those who betray." Her words echoed in his mind, but he stood firm, convinced he had made the right choice. Later, alone in the now empty mansion, Evan felt a strange mix of emotions. The estate no longer seemed as foreboding, but there was no sense of relief either. He knew he still had a long road ahead, rebuilding his life and helping his mother recover from the shadows of their past. The next day, Evan met with a lawyer assigned to handle the estate matters following Helen's arrest. To his surprise, the lawyer handed him a letter, signed in her handwriting. "Evan, I knew this moment would come. You turned out to be smarter than I expected. But remember, revenge is a closed circle. It consumes those who delve into it. I'm leaving you the house. This isn't an act of kindness but a reminder. You may use it as you wish, but the consequences of your decisions will follow you, just as they followed me." Evan stared at the letter, pondering her words. Whatever had driven Helen, anger, a thirst for vengeance, or something more complex, she had left him a piece of her world, her legacy. He wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or uneasy. In the weeks that followed, Evan began sorting through everything Helen had left behind. He hired experts to evaluate the property and listed it for sale. The mansion was quickly purchased as a cultural landmark, and the proceeds allowed him to pay off his debts, fund his mother's medical treatment, and finally give his family a chance to rebuild their lives. But he didn't stop there. While reviewing the estate's documents, Evan uncovered details about the many people affected by Helen's schemes. These weren't just businessmen and officials. There were ordinary families who had lost everything. This discovery inspired him to create a foundation to assist victims of financial crimes. The project became his new mission. Mike, his trusted friend, proved invaluable in the endeavor. Together, they brainstormed how to use the remaining funds for the greater good. "This is your chance to make a real difference," Mike said one evening as they worked on the foundation's plans. "You can turn this dark story into something meaningful." Evan nodded, feeling a spark of something new in his chest. Not anger, not despair, but determination. A few months later, the foundation launched. Evan became a public figure, openly sharing his story to warn others about how easily one could fall into someone else's web of manipulation. His honesty resonated with many, and people began reaching out for help. Yet the past wasn't entirely behind him. One morning, as he sifted through his mail, he found a new letter. This time, it came from prison. The return address bore the name, Helen Whitmore. "Evan, I've heard about your successes. You've chosen a path I couldn't take. Perhaps you're right, revenge is destructive. But I don't regret what I've done. It was my truth. You, however, have found yours. You're stronger than I thought. Perhaps we're not so different, as much as that might irritate you. Remember, people will always judge us by what we leave behind. Make sure your legacy isn't as heavy as mine." Evan held the letter in his hands, rereading it several times. Her words made him pause. Did he have the right to judge her? And could he avoid making the same mistakes she had? On the anniversary of Helen's arrest, Evan stood before a group of people in a small hall. It was the first grant ceremony for his foundation. He felt a twinge of nervousness, but looking at the faces of those who would now receive help, he knew it had all been worth it. "This foundation isn't just about money," he began, his voice steady and confident. "It's about giving people a chance to start over without being haunted by their past. It's something I couldn't have achieved if I hadn't made a choice that changed everything." The room erupted into applause. Among the crowd, he spotted his mother's smile. She looked healthier and happier than she had in years. As the ceremony ended, Evan stepped outside. The sky was clear, the air crisp. He felt free, perhaps for the first time in his life. Helen's letter, tucked in his pocket, no longer felt like a reminder of the past but a symbol of how far he had come.